Henry VIII, the Tudor King of England, is a man who needs little introduction. He's been the subject of plays since the days of William Shakespeare and fictionalized in modern movies, books, and television. Many people know him for his turbulent love life, or as the king who broke from Rome and formed the Church of England. But who was Henry behind the headlines? Is he deserving of the infamy he's gained? And what impact did his actions have on England? We'll delve into these questions tonight. So just relax and let your mind drift as we explore the sleepy history of King Henry VIII. It's March the 1st, 1522. A Shrovetide pageant, with elements of a masquerade ball, is well underway, hosted by Cardinal Wolsey, Lord High Chancellor of England. While we don't know if the following story is entirely true, it paints a picture of events that will change the course of English history. A prop castle has been erected in the Grand Hall as part of a Tudor celebration in which guests act out a play. Dressed in costumes of blue and gold satin, the young men lay siege to the castle. They seek to rescue the 8 pretty damsels, known only by the virtues embroidered on their headbands. Dressed in white satin gowns, with names like Beauty and Mercy, they are guarded by other ladies, jealousy and danger amongst them. It's thought to be here, at the Chateau Vert pageant, that a man and woman lock eyes across a room. For now, he knows her only as Perseverance, as he rescues her from the castle and then joins her in a dance. To those in attendance, it's nothing of note to see King Henry's head turned by a pretty face. Little do they know that today's flirtation is the beginning of an affair that will change the shape of England. Henry's love for the Lady Anne Boleyn will lead him to divorce Queen Catherine of Aragon. He'll separate England from the Catholic Church in Rome, naming himself supreme head of the new Church of England. Like him or loathe him, it's impossible to deny that Henry VIII left his mark on history. Henry was born at the Royal Greenwich Palace on June 28, 1491. He was the second son of King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York, whose marriage had united long warring houses. He was educated separately from his brother Arthur, being that Arthur was older and expected to become king. Still, Henry would have enjoyed an excellent education, with the finest tutors that Europe had to offer. He was taught a curriculum ranging from politics to poetry, and would have been fluent in at least French and Latin. At 10 years old, he played a role in the ceremonies surrounding his brother's royal wedding. Arthur was 15 in 1501 when he married the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. Sadly, the marriage would be short-lived because Arthur passed away just months after the wedding. Henry would assume his brother's titles, becoming the new Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester. They were added to a list of other titles, which Henry had been given from the age of 2. One of these titles was a Knight of the Bath, for which he had participated in an elaborate ceremony. The 3-year-old prince had been placed in a special bathtub and read aloud the requirements of a chivalric knight. He'd been baptized by the king, who made the sign of the cross on his shoulder before praying through the night dressed in hermit's robes. In the morning, he rode a horse through Westminster Hall, where his father dubbed him a Knight of the Realm, tapping a great sword on one shoulder, then another. Of all the ceremonies that Henry would take part in through his lifetime, the impact of this one would be amongst the most profound. From this moment onwards, he believed himself a knight, even when his behavior fell far short of chivalry. For his father, however, it was mostly for show. The king seemed intent on protecting the little knight, shielding him from responsibility even after Arthur's death. It's unclear why his father kept him from the limelight, but it seems to have left him somewhat unprepared for the role of king. His father had been keen to arrange a marriage between Henry and Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was 18 and Henry was 12 when the pair were betrothed in 1503. Theirs would be a long engagement, with Henry himself going back and forth. At age 14, he declared he would not marry Catherine. Meanwhile, the Spanish princess grew only more certain. It was God's will that she be married to Henry. Marry they did in 1509, when she was 24 and he was 17. That same year, Henry had been crowned King of England. He claimed to be fulfilling his father's dying wish that his son marry the Spanish princess. Their coronation took place at Westminster Abbey, and by all accounts was a dazzling affair. golden tapestries were dangled from windows, and the streets were lined with cheering crowds. People came in droves to see the royal procession, the king and queen on horseback in all their jewels and finery. One of the first orders of business for the young king was to rid himself of political opponents. Just 2 days after his coronation, he ordered the executions of 2 nobles on charges of high treason. This would be a pattern throughout Henry's reign when it came to anyone who got in his way. While he had some capacity for mercy, offering pardons occasionally, his overall propensity was for ruthlessness, not forgiveness. The young king was also ambitious, and his thoughts quickly turned towards conquest. Like his predecessors from the 14th century onwards, Henry thought himself the rightful ruler of France. Henry's father had maintained a tense, yet sometimes allied, relationship with the French king, Louis XII. And initially, the son renewed these bonds, likely not wanting to make an enemy of the French, who had aligned with the Holy Roman Empire in modern-day Germany. Later, however, he signed a pact with Spain, an alliance with his father-in-law, King Ferdinand II. Under Ferdinand's guidance, he joined the anti-French Holy League, established by Pope Julius II. Plans were made for an Anglo-Spanish assault, in which Henry hoped to recover Aquitaine for England. War was officially declared in 1512, 3 years into the young Tudor's reign. The initial attack was considered a failure, though diplomatically speaking, it was a great success. Henry met with the Holy Roman Emperor and convinced Maximilian, against the odds, to join the Pope's anti-French League. It was such a feat that Pope Julius dubbed Henry the most Christian king of France. Success in battle followed a year later, and this time it was Henry who led the army himself. His troops laid siege to Terouanne in northern France, hoping to starve the city into surrender. The French sent in their cavalry, but they misjudged the distance. They were bombarded by arrows and chased off at speed. The English named it the Battle of the Spurs, mocking the speed at which the French had retreated. In the grand scheme of things, it was a fairly minor victory. But through clever propaganda, Henry made the win seem far greater and used it to bolster his reputation through Europe. Henry gave Terouanne to Emperor Maximilian, before taking the rich city of Tournai in present-day Belgium for the English. He built an enormous fortress as a symbol of English rule, its citadel remaining to this very day. Meanwhile, back in England, he'd left the Queen in charge, something that speaks to the trust he held in her. Indeed, Henry wasn't long out of the country when Catherine would be called into action. Scotland and France had maintained what was called the Auld Alliance since the late 1200s. Believing England vulnerable and encouraged by the French monarch, King James IV of Scotland made his move. The Scottish king rode at the head of his army, invading northern England in September 1513. Catherine oversaw the English defences and placed the Earl of Surrey in command of the army. It would be the largest ever battle fought between the neighbouring countries, and a momentous victory for England and their queen. Catherine had proven herself a force to be reckoned with. Just as Henry had lived out his fantasy of being a medieval warrior king, he would likely have fought more. But wars were costly, and the English crown was out of money. It was here that Cardinal Wolsey, the king's chief advisor, presented Henry with an interesting idea. If he couldn't achieve fame by beating France on the battlefield, then he might instead make his name as the bringer of peace. What followed was the grandest and most opulent peace summit in European history, named the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. It was an event made to showcase the peace that had been brokered, and an opportunity for France and England to show off their respective wealth. An entire pop-up city was erected for the summit on neutral ground between England and France. There were tents of gold cloth and fountains filled with wine, and a massive yard where jousting took place. The jewel in the crown was a temporary Tudor palace, painted to look like a real brick mansion. It was a huge success in terms of public relations, a much talked about event captured in paintings and on tapestries. And though the peace would only last for 8 years in total, that was actually some achievement in the context of the time. War never seemed too far away in a climate of competition between France and England. Even more so after the passing of King Louis XII, leaving his son, Francis, to ascend the throne at age 20. For the time being, Henry had other matters to deal with, namely his failure to produce a son and heir. Catherine had suffered a number of stillbirths and lost an infant son at just 7 weeks old. Only their daughter Mary would survive into adulthood and later sit on the English throne. Henry's mistress, Elizabeth Blount, gave birth to a son in 1519. The boy, Henry Fitzroy, although illegitimate, was honoured by the king and made the Duke of Richmond. Had he lived past the age of 17, he might well have been named Henry's legitimate heir. It might sound like bad behaviour for a man to have mistresses and illegitimate children, but affairs were fairly commonplace in Tudor England, and Henry's behaviour wouldn't have raised many eyebrows. What did shock the court was his affair with Anne Boleyn. She was the sister of Mary, who had also been Henry's mistress, possibly even at the time of the pageant when he met Anne, who had played the part of the virtue perseverance. Henry had become infatuated with Anne, who was lively, well-educated, vivacious, and charismatic. She was also clever in that she refused his seductions, not wanting to end up another discarded mistress. Anne's refusal to sleep with Henry only increased the king's affection. And in the backdrop of Catherine's struggles to give him a son, an idea began to form in the English king's mind. He began to believe that his marriage to Catherine was blighted in the eyes of God, that in marrying his brother's widow, he had acted against the Bible, which is why they hadn't been able to have sons. It's not unreasonable to think that Henry really believed this. He'd proven himself a devout Catholic, even publishing a pamphlet early in his reign, which championed the Pope's authority in Europe. Yet now the king, this so-called defender of the faith, found himself at odds with the Catholic Church. His appeals to Rome to have his marriage annulled were repeatedly discounted. Even after a court had pored over the evidence, the cardinal who had been sent from Rome refused to make a decision. His master, the Pope, wouldn't risk upsetting Queen Catherine's nephew, the new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's right-hand man, bore the brunt of the king's anger. He was charged with praemunire, or overstepping royal authority, and died awaiting trial in 1530. Wolsey's replacement was Thomas More, a fervent Catholic who opposed the annulment. However, at first, the Lord Chancellor seemed to support Henry, who by now had become only more determined. the king had Queen Catherine banished from court and moved Anne Boleyn into her apartments. Their desire to marry was an open secret. At court, they acted like husband and wife. In 1532, Henry met with the French king and gained Francis's support for his marriage to Anne. He then married her in secret upon returning to England, before a second formal wedding in January 1533. By this point, Anne was already pregnant, so there was a need to speed up annulment proceedings. A reformer named Thomas Cranmer was made Archbishop of Canterbury and was asked to oversee what was called the King's Great Matter. Anne was instrumental in Cranmer's appointment, as well as introducing the king to new doctrines and ideas. For a 16th century lady, she was well read on theology and was known to own books written by Protestant reformers. We might say that Anne was a religious reformer. She promoted reading the Bible in English instead of Latin, even handing out English prayer books to those in her house. And she argued for changes within the Catholic Church, calling for an end to greed and corruption. Of course, much like Henry, it seems somewhat convenient that the reformers whose beliefs Anne adopted were aligned with her and Henry's interests. One didn't have to look hard to see an ulterior motive beneath the king's sudden change of heart. Henry assembled a council of scholars to investigate whether the Pope had authority over England. And after studying the evidence, both secular and religious, they determined that the Pope had unlawfully claimed power from what had been a self-governing national church. The king read carefully through the council's findings, making notes in the margins that survive to this day. With each page turned, he became only more convinced that the king, not the Pope, was the rightful head of the church. He went on to publish The Glass of Truth, which espoused the view that the English people should never accept the rule of any foreign leader. Refusing the authority of the Pope in Rome was framed, quite successfully, as a simple matter of patriotism. Next, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's new chief advisor, pushed through legislation forbidding appeals to the Pope. This meant that Henry was the highest authority in the country, and thus might proceed as he wanted. This paved the way for his hand-picked Archbishop, Cranmer, to declare Henry's first marriage null and void. Catherine was stripped of her title, becoming Princess Dowager as the widow of Henry's brother. On May the 28th, 1533, the Church of England declared Anne and Henry's union legal. Anne was crowned queen just a few days later and gave birth to their daughter, Elizabeth, in early September. Catherine and Henry's daughter, Mary, was proclaimed illegitimate through the Act of Succession in 1533. Mary was supplanted by her stepsister, Elizabeth, now that only Anne's children were in the line of succession. A year later came the Acts of Supremacy, in which Parliament formally recognized the king as the supreme head of the English Church. Henry now enjoyed a level of power which was unmatched by the monarchs of Christian Europe. It's difficult to overstate the significance of these laws in a country that had been Roman Catholic for 1,000 years. The Pope had held sway over people's immortal souls. But now, only Henry had absolute power. Naturally, not all were happy with the change, either because they worried about the loss of their own power or through genuine concern for their immortal soul. Many feared hell and eternal damnation, especially once Pope Clement excommunicated Henry. This fear was enough for some to refuse the king's command when he ordered them to take the oath of supremacy. Anyone who held office, including the clergy, had to swear allegiance to Henry as supreme governor of the church. 18 dissenting monks were the first to be put to death for their refusal to take the oath. Others later executed included Sir Thomas More, the devout Catholic and former Lord Chancellor, whom Henry had long called a good friend. And yet, resistance continued to grow, especially after a new law came in 1535, entitled the Suppression of Religious Houses Act. This marked the beginning of a years-long project, first overseen by Thomas Cromwell. Catholic buildings across England, Wales, and Ireland were seized by Cromwell in the name of the king. Abbeys, monasteries, convents, and priories, their inhabitants were displaced, their land and buildings sold, their assets seized and given to the crown. With the English Reformation now well underway, the king sought to herald a new religious order. Ridding the country of Catholic institutions would help consolidate his power far and wide, and the money made from confiscating such properties would help the king to fund his foreign wars. It was a step forward in the king's new regime. But to some of his subjects, this was the final straw. In northern England, the peasants rose up in revolt. with numbers upwards of 40,000. The Pilgrimage of the Grace, as the uprising was known, was led by the lawyer Robert Aske and nobles from the north. Beginning in Yorkshire, it spread across northern England, with the rebels managing to occupy both Hull and York. The Duke of Norfolk went to meet the rebels with an army of no more than 7,000 men. Being massively outnumbered, he was inclined towards diplomacy and agreed to present their petition to the king. It was a list of 24 demands, both secular and religious. He gave the insurgents a number of assurances, hoping to avoid a conflict which he would surely lose. Upon the promise of a general pardon and a parliament within the year, Aske agreed to send everyone home. Norfolk hadn't been authorized to make such promises, and so, following further unrest in February 1537, Henry had the ringleaders, including Aske, arrested. Charged with treason, they were subsequently executed. 216 would be killed in total. Henry had successfully put down the rebellion, which was the most serious uprising to be faced by a Tudor monarch. Of course, it might be said that it was of the king's own making. The steps he'd taken in order to marry Anne had led to political, social, and economic upheaval. And regardless of the reasons behind his actions, Henry had put his own needs above the needs of his people. Though, perhaps none of this would have seemed quite so egregious if it weren't for what happened in his second marriage. Because despite courting Anne for several years and nearly ripping apart the country in order to wed her, married life for Henry was far from happy. The same qualities that had attracted him to Anne at first, her vivacious, outspoken, and sometimes fiery nature, were now a source of frustration for the king. She wasn't the obedient wife he wanted. Her greatest betrayal, as Henry saw it, was her failure to produce him a son and heir. After Elizabeth's birth, Anne miscarried twice, the last time after hearing that the king was injured jousting and losing a baby boy upon going into shock. Enemies of Anne and the now powerful Boleyns spread rumors throughout the court of her witchcraft and adultery. This gave Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief advisor, the means to give Henry a way out of the marriage. At the start of May 1536, Queen Anne was arrested, as were 5 men, including her own brother, George. It didn't seem to matter that there was little to no evidence of charges that ranged from treasonous adultery to incest. Archbishop Cranmer, whom Anne had helped to have appointed, would be the one to annul her marriage to Henry. After hearing her confession, he was so convinced of her innocence that he appealed her case to the king, albeit unsuccessfully. Anne was beheaded on the 19th of May. Cranmer was one of the few people to publicly mourn her death. Many tell of her poise on the stand, where she forgave her executioner and praised Henry. Whether the king was deserving is a matter of opinion. Almost as soon as Anne had been arrested, he'd had her lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, moved into the Queen's apartments. Henry, who was then in his mid-40s, married Jane, who was in her late 20s, less than a fortnight after Anne's execution. With the Second Succession Act in 1536, Elizabeth and Mary were deemed illegitimate, and Jane's offspring claimed as the rightful heirs. Henry's third wife, Jane, would give him the son he'd longed for, Prince Edward, born in 1537. Unfortunately, Henry's joy would be tinged with grief. Jane developed an infection during childbirth and died 12 days after Edward was born. Henry would go on to grieve the Queen's loss, suffering periods of longing and depression. Whether their marriage would have remained happy had Jane lived is something that we'll never know. But considering Henry's pattern of behavior, it seems unlikely that things wouldn't have gone awry. Even as short as their marriage was, and as submissive as Jane was compared to Anne, when she begged him, on her knees, to reform the abbeys, he told her never to dare meddle in his affairs, and to remember what happened to her predecessor, Anne. This version of Henry seems far removed from the boy who, at 3, had promised to follow the knightly code. By his late 40s, the king had an unbridled ego. He tolerated nothing but utter obedience. After Jane's death, Cromwell had gone to work in negotiating marriages for both Henry and his children. For the king, he'd suggested Anne of Cleves, a German princess from the Holy Roman Empire. Anne's brother, the Duke of Cleves, would be a useful ally against Roman Catholic Europe. Henry agreed to the match after hearing from courtiers who gave descriptions of the lady's beauty, and after seeing her portrait painted by the renowned artist Hans Holbein the Younger. But when they met in person, Henry was reportedly less than impressed with her appearance. He married her in January 1540, simply because things had gone too far to call it off. He later claimed the marriage had never been consummated and had it annulled in July of that same year. This outcome for Anne of Cleves was actually rather good, especially in comparison to what happened to Henry's other wives. Given the title of the king's sister, she was provided with houses and an allowance, and was said to enjoy a friendship with the king, as well as his daughters Mary and Elizabeth. She met a far happier end than his next wife, Catherine Howard, or his advisor, Thomas Cromwell, who fell out of favour around the time of the marriage. It's possible Henry blamed Cromwell for his failed marriage to Anne of Cleves. He was charged with treason, amongst other things, and executed soon after. Henry married Catherine Howard on the day of Cromwell's execution, July the 28th, 1540. He was 49 and she only about 17 years old. To some, it must have seemed doomed from the start. The king was smitten with his young, pretty queen. He showered her with gifts, including Cromwell's estates. But Catherine, it seems, didn't entirely reciprocate, and, being flirtatious and naive, she engaged in an affair. Catherine exchanged love letters and had private meetings with Thomas Culpeper, a close friend of Henry's. She also had a courtier named Francis Derham, with whom she later admitted to having relations before her marriage when she was around 14 years old. Henry refused to believe it at first, but it was impossible to deny after Derham confessed, and then went on to tell of the Queen's affair with Culpeper. All three were executed after being charged with treason. Catherine was beheaded in February 1542. By July of the following year, the king had remarried. His sixth and final wife was Catherine Parr. A wealthy widow in her early 30s, she was a calming influence in the king's later life. Catherine Parr oversaw Edward and Elizabeth's education, and she was instrumental in healing the rift between Henry and his daughters. She encouraged the king's passing of the Third Succession Act, in which the two daughters were restored into the royal bloodline. She was also the first queen to publish a book under her own name, Prayers and Meditations, in 1545. Something of a religious reformer, her views were very different to Henry's. In fact, she narrowly escaped arrest, but reconciled with the king. Like Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, she acted as Queen Regent when Henry was at war. Having secretly aligned with the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry had planned an attack on France. First, he sought to defeat their allies in Scotland, led by their king and his nephew, James V. Henry defeated the Scottish forces at the Battle of Solway Moss in November 1542. However, his attempts to unite the countries would ultimately fail, and they would remain at war until the end of Henry's reign. The king invaded France in 1544, as per his agreement with the Holy Roman Emperor. He laid siege to Boulogne, taking personal command of the army, but was forced to return home once his allies had sued for peace. When a French invasion of England was later unsuccessful, France and England would make peace once again. Both countries were nearly bankrupted by the war, and they signed the Treaty of Camp in 1546. By then, Henry was a man in his 50s and far from the athletic youth he'd once been. For a decade, he'd been plagued with painful boils and myriad other ailments after a jousting injury. The king was obese and had difficulty moving. He needed aids to walk with, including a wheelchair or tram. He was 55 years old when he died, likely of renal and liver failure, combined with possible heart failure and sepsis, on the 28th of January, 1547. Henry was buried next to Jane Seymour, the wife who died after giving birth to a male heir. However, her son, King Edward, would reign for just 6 years before passing away at age 15. After him, Henry's daughter Mary would rule for 5 years, earning the name Bloody Mary because she executed people she considered to be heretics. Finally, her sister Elizabeth would take the throne, becoming one of the most influential monarchs in British history. Henry's legacy is a fascinating one, filled with myriad contradictions. Here was a man whose belief in his own divinity empowered the very worst and most human of flaws. A devout Catholic, named Protector of the Faith, who executed Catholics and Protestants alike. At best, the king was extremely charismatic. At worst, he was lustful, paranoid, violent, and egotistical. A tyrant on the throne, none were ever truly safe, especially his wives. And his actions resulted in centuries of religious conflict in England. Perhaps the greatest irony of Henry's reign was his obsession with having a son and heir. Because of all his children, it would be his daughter, Elizabeth, who would bring peace and prosperity back to England.